James had always lived a quiet life. Every night, when the tall glass building lit up with thousands of shining lights, he would begin his shift as the janitor. To many people who worked in that building, he was simply the janitor. He wore a navy uniform, carried a set of keys on his belt, and pushed his cleaning cart from one floor to another. He did his work with patience and care, but almost no one paid attention to him. People walked by, sometimes nodding politely, but most never wondered who he really was. For years, James had accepted this invisibility. It was easier to stay in the background, easier to let people think he was just the man who mopped the floors. But James had a secret. Behind his simple uniform and quiet job, he carried something extraordinary. He spoke 10 languages. It wasn't just a trick or a hobby, it was something he had dedicated his life to learning. Long before he became a janitor, James had loved words, loved the way each language had its own music, its own rhythm. Growing up in a tough neighborhood, books and foreign radio stations became his escape. While his friends played outside, James would listen to Spanish songs, French news, or Chinese broadcasts. He repeated the words to himself again and again, teaching his tongue to shape new sounds. His gift grew stronger over time, but life had not been kind. Family responsibilities and financial struggles pushed him into this job that barely paid the bills. Still, he carried his love for languages inside him like a fire no one could see. One evening, after a long day for the company, the building was almost empty. The offices were silent, except for the hum of air conditioners and the squeak of James's cleaning cart wheels. He liked these hours. There were no rushing employees, no loud phones, no meetings. Just silence and space. As he cleaned the glass walls outside the CEO's office, his phone buzzed. It was his cousin from overseas. Smiling, James answered, slipping into French without even thinking. "Comment ça va," he said warmly, his voice low but cheerful. His cousin replied quickly, and James laughed, switching to Spanish mid-sentence when another family member joined the call. What James didn't know was that he wasn't alone. Mr. Thompson, the CEO of the company, had stayed later than usual that night. He had just finished a call in another office and was walking back toward his own. As he approached, he heard voices. At first, he thought an employee was still working, maybe talking to a client. But then he stopped. The voice was coming from the janitor, the man he had seen hundreds of times pushing his cart quietly through the halls. Mr. Thompson frowned, curious. He leaned slightly against the wall, listening. To his surprise, James wasn't just chatting in one language. He was moving between them as if it were the easiest thing in the world. French flowed smoothly, then Spanish rolled off his tongue with confidence. Moments later, he spoke Arabic with precision and warmth. The CEO stood frozen. It didn't make sense. Why would a janitor be able to speak like a diplomat? James kept talking, unaware of the quiet figure listening just a few feet away. When his cousin introduced a friend from Germany on the call, James switched to German without hesitation, his tone shifting perfectly to match. Mr. Thompson's eyes widened. He had traveled the world, met interpreters, hired translators, but he had never heard someone change languages this effortlessly. For several minutes, the CEO remained hidden, his expensive leather shoes planted firmly on the carpet as if he might disturb the magic by moving. He watched James wipe down the glass wall with one hand, phone balanced on his shoulder, while casually speaking in languages most employees in the company had never even heard before. Finally, James ended the call with a laugh, switching back to English as naturally as breathing. "All right, I'll talk to you soon. Take care." He put the phone in his pocket and sighed, returning to his work, humming softly to himself. Mr. Thompson stayed still for another moment, his mind racing. He had always believed he knew his employees, at least the important ones, the executives, the managers, the department heads. But here was a man he had overlooked for years, a man whose talent might be greater than anyone in his office. James, meanwhile, felt nothing unusual. For him, this was just another night of cleaning. He had no idea that his life was about to change, that the few words spoken in the quiet hallway would lead to something far beyond his imagination. As Mr. Thompson finally walked away, his footsteps echoing softly, a plan began forming in his mind. He needed to know more about this janitor. Who was he really? Why was he here, hidden in plain sight? For James, the night ended the way it always did. He finished cleaning, locked the supply room, and walked home through the empty streets. He thought about his cousin, about the joy of speaking languages, and about the small world he had built for himself. He never dreamed that the CEO had heard everything, that the man who controlled the future of the company now saw him in a completely different light. The next morning, Mr. Thompson arrived at the office earlier than usual. He couldn't stop thinking about what he had heard the night before. He kept seeing the janitor's calm face, his hand moving across the glass with the cloth, and his voice shifting between languages like water flowing from one stream into another. It bothered him, not in a negative way, but in a way that stirred curiosity deep inside him. How could someone with such talent be working as a janitor in his building? He had built his company on finding great talent, yet here was a man who had been working under his nose for years, and he had never noticed. Throughout the morning, the CEO sat in his large corner office, staring at the city skyline, trying to focus on his schedule. Meetings, reports, phone calls, all of it seemed dull compared to the memory of James speaking German and Arabic with ease. At one point, he even caught himself testing his own rusty French aloud, chuckling at how clumsy it sounded compared to what he had heard the night before. He decided he had to know more. By mid-morning, the whispers had already begun. 2 employees who had passed through the lobby the previous night had witnessed James speaking with the CEO in German. They hadn't heard the full conversation, but it was enough for gossip to spread. "Did you know the janitor speaks German?" one employee asked another at the coffee machine. "Not just German," the other replied, "I think it was French too." Soon, small groups of workers were talking about the strange rumor. By lunchtime, it had reached almost every floor. The janitor could speak multiple languages. James, meanwhile, carried on with his work as usual. He arrived in the afternoon for his shift, wearing his plain navy uniform, carrying his cart filled with supplies. People glanced at him differently now. Some looked curious, some skeptical, and some even amused. "Is it true?" whispered a young intern as James walked past. James ignored it, thinking it was just idle chatter. He had learned long ago not to let people's opinions distract him from his responsibilities. But that day would not be like any other. Around 2 in the afternoon, as James polished the glass doors near the main conference room, Mr. Thompson stepped out of his office and walked directly toward him. The entire floor seemed to hold its breath. It wasn't every day that the CEO, a man known for his serious face and sharp suits, spoke to the janitorial staff. Employees peeked over their cubicles and around corners, curious to see what would happen. "Good afternoon," the CEO said, his voice calm but carrying authority. James straightened up, surprised. "Good afternoon, sir," he replied respectfully. Then, without warning, the CEO switched to German. "Wie geht es Ihnen heute?" he asked, his eyes fixed on James. There was a moment of silence. Employees nearby froze, staring in disbelief. Was the CEO really speaking German to the janitor? James blinked, then smiled faintly and answered in flawless German, "Mir geht es gut, danke. Und Ihnen." His voice was confident, his tone natural, as if he had been speaking it his whole life. Gasps echoed around the room. Employees exchanged shocked looks. The janitor had replied to the CEO in perfect German. The CEO didn't stop there. He switched to Mandarin, a language few in the building even recognized. His words were clumsy, but he managed to ask, "Ni hui shuo zongwen ma?" James, without hesitation, answered in Mandarin, his pronunciation crisp and clear. Wo hui shuo. Nin xiang yang shen muyan zhen wo tanhua, which meant, "Yes, I can. Which language would you like me to use?" By now, a small crowd had gathered, pretending to shuffle papers or refill coffee just to witness the scene. It was surreal, the CEO testing the janitor in foreign languages, and the janitor replying effortlessly, one after another. The CEO leaned back slightly, crossing his arms, a hint of a smile forming on his usually stern face. "Impressive," he said in English at last. "Very impressive." James felt a wave of unease. He hadn't wanted attention. He had spent years blending into the background, doing his work quietly. Now, suddenly, all eyes were on him. He could feel the weight of the stares, the whispers, the curiosity. The CEO, however, wasn't finished. He invited James to his office. The entire floor buzzed with chatter as James followed the CEO down the hallway. What could the CEO want with him, employees whispered. Some even pulled out their phones, messaging colleagues on other floors, "You won't believe this. The janitor is in the CEO's office." Inside the large office, surrounded by tall shelves and city views, James stood quietly as Mr. Thompson studied him. The CEO finally spoke. "How many languages do you know, James?" James hesitated, then replied honestly. 10, sir. Some better than others, but I can speak, read, and understand them all." The CEO's eyebrows rose. 10, he repeated slowly, almost as if testing the word. "Why have you never told anyone?" James looked down at his hands. "Because no one ever asked," he said softly. "People see a janitor, and they assume that's all there is to me. I didn't think it mattered here." For the first time, the CEO felt a strange mix of admiration and guilt. How many times had he walked past James without noticing him? How many years had this man been overlooked, his gift hidden behind a mop and a uniform? "You're wrong," Mr. Thompson said finally, his tone firm but not unkind. "It does matter. It matters a great deal." At that moment, James realized something had shifted. This was no longer just about a janitor and his job. The CEO had seen his hidden talent, and the entire company had witnessed it too. His quiet life, the one he had guarded so carefully, was beginning to unravel in ways he could not yet imagine. As James left the office later that day, employees looked at him differently. Some with admiration, some with disbelief, and some with new respect. The whispers grew louder, spreading across departments like wildfire. By the time evening came, everyone in the building knew, the janitor wasn't just a janitor. He was something far more remarkable. The sun was just beginning to set when James walked into the CEO's office again the next evening. Mr. Thompson had requested to see him privately. The company was buzzing all day with whispers about the janitor who spoke 10 languages, and James could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him. It wasn't easy for him to be the center of attention. He had lived so long in silence, blending into the background, that now standing in the spotlight felt strange, almost uncomfortable. Still, he knew he couldn't avoid the conversation. The CEO gestured for him to sit in one of the leather chairs across the desk. "James," he began, his voice calm but firm, "I want to know your story." James sat with his back straight, hands folded on his lap. For a long moment, he didn't answer. His eyes drifted toward the window, where the city lights were starting to glow. Finally, in a low voice, he said, "It's not an easy story, sir. But if you want to hear it, I will tell you." Mr. Thompson leaned back, giving him space. "I do." James took a deep breath and began. He told the CEO how he had grown up in a poor neighborhood, where opportunities were rare and survival was the main focus. His parents worked long hours just to keep food on the table. While many kids around him got caught up in trouble, James found escape in books. His father had once brought home an old box of discarded textbooks from a university. Inside were dictionaries and language guides in French, Spanish, and Italian. Most people would have thrown them away, James explained, but to me, they were treasure. I didn't understand much at first, but I kept reading, repeating the words, writing them down until they made sense. As he grew older, James discovered radio stations that broadcasted in different languages. He would stay up late at night, listening to voices from faraway countries. He mimicked their sounds, repeating them until they became natural. By the time he was a teenager, he could already hold simple conversations in French and Spanish. Teachers at his school were astonished, but they didn't know what to do with his gift. Opportunities for someone like him were limited, and no one pushed him toward a higher path. Later, James went to college on a small scholarship. There, he studied linguistics, diving deeper into the structures of language. He learned Arabic, Mandarin, and Russian, challenging himself every day. I wanted to understand people, he said softly. To me, every language was like a key that opened the door to another world. When you speak someone's language, you don't just use words, you understand their heart. The CEO listened intently, his usually sharp eyes softening with respect. And after college, he asked. James's expression grew more serious. After college, life got harder. My mother became ill, and my younger siblings needed help. I had to work, sometimes 3 jobs at once. I became a translator for a while, even worked with international organizations. But the jobs were unstable, and when the recession came, I lost everything. The only work I could find that paid regularly was this janitorial job. It wasn't what I wanted, but it kept food on the table. So I stayed. There was silence in the room for a moment. The CEO tapped his fingers lightly on the desk, processing everything he had just heard. So all these years, he said finally, you've been hiding this gift. James shook his head gently. Not hiding. Just surviving. No one ever asked who I was. People saw the uniform, not the man. I didn't think my languages mattered here. The CEO's eyes sharpened. They matter, he said firmly. They matter more than you know. James hesitated, unsure how to respond. A part of him still doubted whether his talents could change anything. He had been overlooked for so long that it was hard to believe someone truly cared now. Mr. Thompson leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. Do you realize what you could do for this company? We deal with partners and clients across the world. Every year, we spend a fortune on interpreters and translators. And here you are, someone who can speak to people in their own language, someone who understands the culture behind the words. You could bridge gaps that others cannot. James looked down, his heart racing. He had never imagined himself in such a role. He had always been the man pushing the cart, sweeping the floors. Could he really stand in boardrooms, speaking to executives and investors? The thought both excited and frightened him. The CEO's voice softened. James, you've been underestimated. But not anymore. I want to give you an opportunity. Not just a small one, but something that will allow you to use your talent fully. James met his gaze, searching for sincerity. Why now? He asked quietly. Why me? Mr. Thompson leaned back, folding his arms. Because you remind me of myself, he admitted. When I was younger, people didn't believe in me either. They thought I wasn't smart enough, not strong enough to build something great. But I proved them wrong. And you, James, you have a gift that deserves to be seen. For the first time, James felt a flicker of hope. Still, a wave of doubt washed over him. Sir, I don't know if I'm ready for that kind of responsibility. The CEO smiled faintly. "You're more ready than you think." The conversation stretched into the evening. James shared more stories, how he had once translated for a small group of refugees, helping them communicate with doctors, how he had guided international students who struggled with English, how he had found joy in teaching children simple words in new languages. Each story revealed a man who was not only skilled but also compassionate, someone who used his gift to lift others up. By the time James left the office, the night sky was dark, and the city lights shimmered like stars. He walked through the halls with a mix of emotions: uncertainty, nervousness, but also a spark of something new, possibility. Outside, as he stepped into the cool night air, James thought about the journey that had brought him here. From a boy with second-hand textbooks to a janitor cleaning floors, and now, perhaps, to something greater. He didn't know what the future held, but he sensed that his life was about to change in ways he could never have predicted. And deep inside, a quiet strength stirred. Maybe, just maybe, it was time for the world to finally see him for who he truly was. The following week began with a sense of quiet tension across the company. Everyone had heard the story. The janitor who spoke 10 languages was no longer just a rumor, he was real, and everyone was watching to see what would happen next. Some employees were skeptical, others curious, and a few even jealous. But one thing was certain: James's life in the company would never be the same again. Mr. Thompson, the CEO, had made his decision. He had told James that he wanted him to step into a new role, though he hadn't revealed exactly what it would be. James had spent the weekend in deep thought. He was nervous, unsure if he could carry the weight of such responsibility, yet part of him longed for the chance. For years, he had been overlooked. For years, his greatest talent had been hidden in silence. Maybe now it was finally time to let it shine. On Monday morning, the company was preparing for one of the biggest meetings of the year. International investors were flying in from Europe, Asia, and South America. Normally, the company hired a team of professional interpreters, but this time, Mr. Thompson had something different in mind. The boardroom was polished to perfection, the long wooden table gleaming under the lights. Large flags of different countries decorated the walls to represent the diversity of the investors attending. The executives were dressed in their sharpest suits, rehearsing their presentations nervously. But all eyes turned when Mr. Thompson entered, followed closely by James, still wearing a neat version of his uniform. A wave of whispers swept through the room. "Is that the janitor?" one executive murmured. "What is he doing here?" another whispered. "I heard he's supposed to translate for us," someone else said in disbelief. The CEO raised his hand for silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said firmly, "today we will do things differently. I want you to meet James, a man whose skills go far beyond what you've seen. He will serve as our language liaison for this meeting." Gasps echoed across the room. Some executives looked shocked, others confused. A few smirked, as if the CEO had made a foolish choice. But before anyone could object, the meeting began. The first investor to speak was from France. He introduced himself in French, expecting an interpreter to step forward. Instead, James leaned forward, smiled politely, and responded in flawless French, welcoming him and acknowledging the importance of his company's partnership. The French investor raised his eyebrows in pleasant surprise. "Très bien," he said with a smile, clearly impressed. Next, a Japanese investor began outlining concerns in Japanese. The executives around the table looked uneasy. Normally, they would wait for a translator. But James listened calmly, then replied in smooth Japanese, addressing each concern clearly and respectfully. The investor, who had been frowning, suddenly broke into a wide smile, nodding in approval. The room began to shift. Skepticism turned to curiosity, and curiosity turned to admiration. Then came a representative from Brazil, speaking in Portuguese, followed by another from Russia. Each time, James responded effortlessly, his tone respectful, his words precise. It was as though he had been doing this all his life. The investors leaned forward, engaged, surprised, and delighted. The executives, who had doubted him only moments before, now watched in awe. At one point, an Italian investor leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and tested James with a complicated phrase filled with idioms that even professional interpreters often struggled with. Without hesitation, James replied with the same idioms in Italian, his voice steady and confident. The investor chuckled and clapped his hands on the table. "Fantastico," he exclaimed. By the middle of the meeting, the atmosphere had completely changed. The investors were relaxed, engaged, and openly impressed. They spoke with enthusiasm, knowing they were truly understood, not just through words but through culture. Deals that normally took hours of careful negotiation began to move quickly. The trust that James built in just a few moments was something no interpreter for hire could have accomplished. The CEO watched all of this with quiet satisfaction. He had taken a risk, and it had paid off. He could see the respect in the investors' eyes, not just for James but for the entire company. They weren't just dealing with another corporation, they were dealing with a company that recognized and valued hidden talent. When the final presentation ended, the investors applauded. One of them, a businessman from Spain, stood up and said in Spanish, "I have worked with many companies across the world, but never have I seen something like this. To find such brilliance in a man so humble, it shows the character of this company." Others nodded in agreement, clapping their hands. The executives looked around at each other, stunned. The man they had once passed by in the hallways without a second glance had just sealed one of the biggest deals in company history. As the investors left the boardroom, many shook James's hand personally, thanking him in their own languages. James responded to each of them, switching languages smoothly, showing respect to each culture. For the first time, he felt truly seen, not as a janitor, but as the man he had always been inside, a linguist, a bridge between worlds. When the last guest had left, the boardroom fell into silence. Everyone turned to look at James. Then, slowly, one executive began to clap. Another joined in, then another, until the entire room was applauding. James felt his face grow warm, but inside, his heart swelled with pride. The CEO rose from his chair, placed a hand on James's shoulder, and said, "Today, you have not only impressed our partners but also taught us all a lesson. Greatness can be hidden in the most unexpected places. James, you are proof of that." James lowered his head humbly. "Thank you, sir," he said quietly. But deep inside, he knew this was more than gratitude. This was the moment that would change everything. The janitor who once mopped floors in silence had now stood in the spotlight and shown the world what he was capable of. As the employees left the room, many stopped to shake his hand, their eyes filled with respect. No longer whispers of disbelief, but words of admiration filled the air. Incredible. Unbelievable. Truly inspiring. James walked out of the boardroom not as a janitor but as a man who had just opened the door to a new chapter of his life. And though he didn't yet know what his official role would become, one thing was certain: the company would never look at him the same way again. The days that followed the meeting felt almost unreal for James. For years he had walked the same halls, pushing his cart, polishing the same glass walls, and emptying the same trash bins without a second glance from anyone. Now, when he entered the building, people stopped what they were doing to greet him. Executives smiled warmly, interns whispered his name, and employees who had once passed him without a word now treated him with respect. He wasn't used to this attention. A part of him still felt like the man in the shadows, but another part of him, quiet and strong, was beginning to accept that his life had truly changed. Mr. Thompson called James into his office only 2 days after the international meeting. The CEO's face, usually firm and serious, carried an expression of pride. "James, he began, "you've shown us all something powerful. You reminded me, and everyone else here, that greatness does not always wear a suit or sit at the head of the table. It can sweep floors, polish glass, and still hold more brilliance than most of us imagine. I cannot allow your talent to remain hidden any longer." James shifted in his seat. He wasn't sure where this was going, but he could feel his heart racing. The CEO continued. "As of today, you are no longer a janitor. I am promoting you to Director of Global Communications. You will lead our international negotiations, represent us at global conferences, and train a team to follow in your footsteps. You will finally have the platform you deserve." For a moment, James could not speak. His throat tightened, and his eyes stung. The words felt almost too big, too heavy to be real. He thought of his mother, who had always told him, "Son, your gift will open doors one day." He thought of his younger siblings, who had looked up to him, even when he came home exhausted from cleaning offices at night. And he thought of the countless times he had been ignored, dismissed, or looked down upon simply because of his uniform. All of those moments had led to this. "Thank you, sir," James said at last, his voice steady though his hands trembled slightly. "I will not let you down." Mr. Thompson smiled and stood, extending his hand. "I know you won't." News of the promotion spread quickly, and soon it was official: the janitor had become an executive. Newspapers picked up the story, calling it the rise of the multilingual janitor. Online articles praised the company for recognizing hidden talent. Messages of support flooded in from across the country. People who had once felt invisible in their own jobs found hope in James's story. They saw in him proof that dignity and greatness could exist in any role, and that sometimes the world simply needed to open its eyes. But James did not let the attention change him. He still greeted the cleaning staff warmly, still smiled at the security guards, and still treated every person he met with respect. He remembered too well what it felt like to be unseen, and he promised himself he would never let anyone else feel that way under his watch. One of his first acts as director was to create a mentorship program inside the company. He called it Hidden Gems. The goal was simple: to give overlooked employees a chance to showcase their talents. He invited clerks, assistants, and workers from every department to join. Some could code, some were skilled designers, others spoke rare languages or had experience in areas no one had known about. James personally mentored them, helping them believe in their value. Slowly, the company culture began to change. People no longer judged by uniforms or job titles. They began to look deeper. Months passed, and James grew into his new role with quiet strength. He traveled with the CEO to conferences in Europe, Asia, and Africa. Wherever they went, James became the bridge between cultures. He could sit with a group of Chinese business leaders, laugh with Brazilian partners, and share stories with Russian investors, all in their native languages. Deals that had once taken months were now concluded in weeks, thanks to the trust James created. The company flourished, and so did James. At one conference in Geneva, James stood before a crowd of hundreds, speaking in English before seamlessly switching to French, then Spanish, then Arabic. The audience erupted in applause. Later, a journalist asked him how he had managed to learn so many languages. James smiled gently and said, "I learned because I loved people. Every language is a doorway to understanding someone's soul. I wanted to open as many doors as possible." Back home, his story continued to inspire. Universities invited him to speak to students, and organizations asked him to share his journey. He often told them the same thing: don't let the world's judgment define you. Your uniform, your title, or your current job does not decide your worth. What's inside you does. Despite the fame and respect, James remained humble. He still lived in his modest home, still visited his old neighborhood, and still helped young kids learn languages for free in his spare time. On weekends, he would sit with a group of children in the local library, teaching them simple words in French or Spanish, watching their eyes light up with the same wonder he had felt as a boy. One evening, after a long day at the office, James returned home and sat quietly by his window. The city lights glittered outside, just as they had on the night the CEO overheard him speaking on the phone. He thought about how much had changed since then. He was no longer invisible. He was no longer just the man with a mop. He was a leader, a mentor, and an example that life could turn around in the most unexpected ways. Yet in his heart, he remained the same James, a man who loved languages, who respected people, and who believed that dignity could be found in every role. The company, too, was never the same again. Thanks to James, the culture shifted from one of silent judgment to one of respect and openness. Employees began to look for hidden gems in each other, recognizing that talent often lived where no one expected it. The CEO often reminded the board, "We must never forget what James taught us. Greatness can be found anywhere. It is our job to see it." As for James, his story spread far beyond the walls of the company. People across the country, and even the world, began sharing his journey as an example of hope. They called him the janitor who spoke 10 languages, but to those who knew him personally, he was simply James, the man who never gave up on himself, even when the world overlooked him. And so, his legacy lived on. Not just in the deals he secured or the languages he spoke, but in the hearts of those he inspired. His journey was a reminder that sometimes, the most powerful stories are not written in boardrooms or on stages, but in the quiet persistence of a man who believes in his gift, even when no one else does.